Good day. Over the course of yesterday, Ukraine began what I am sure is the opening act of its much debated, much talked about offensive in the Zaporozhzhie region. Now, I say that because the scale of the forces that Ukraine has committed to this attack, if one believes the Russian Ministry of Defense, are such that it seems to me that we're talking about something a lot bigger than a reconnaissance in force, as some have been describing the operations of yesterday, or probing attacks or shaping operations, as other people call them. Let's first of all go to what the Russian Ministry of Defense said about the first major attack, which took place yesterday. I should say that there have been others since then. This is what the Russian Ministry of Defense said. On 4th June, the enemy, that's to say obviously the Ukrainian forces, made an unsuccessful attempt at a large-scale offensive in South Donetsk direction. Now, I ought to say that all the fighting has taken place in southern Donetsk, not really in Zaporozhzhie region. Vladimir Rogov, who is one of the officials of the Russian-appointed government in Zaporozhye region, says that what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to try to break through Ukrainian defense lines in southern Donetsk region, because this is the fastest route, or rather the shortest route, to reach the Sea of Azov, which seems for the moment to be the primary Ukrainian objective. And he says that there are many problems that Ukraine would face taking this route, not the least of which is that Russian fortifications in this area are quite strong, but nonetheless, that seems to be what the Ukrainians aim to do. Anyway, to continue with what the Russian Ministry of Defense says, 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions were deployed on the Ukrainian side. 6 mechanized battalions. Now, I'm guessing that's perhaps roughly 3,000 men, assuming 500 men in a battalion. I think that's a reasonable guess. 2 tank battalions, might be perhaps 60 tanks in total, again assuming 30 tanks per battalion. A force of 60 tanks and 3,000 infantry is much more than one would use in a reconnaissance in force or in a shaping operation or probing attack. So, as I said, this looks to me like a serious attempt by Ukraine to get its offensive started. And anyway, this is what the Russians go on to say. As a result of the active actions by the units of the Vostok group of forces, airstrikes and artillery inflicted significant losses on the enemy close to Neskuchnoye and Novodarovka. The enemy losses were 300 servicemen, 16 tanks, 26 armoured fighting vehicles, and 14 motor vehicles. The enemy didn't achieve their goals. And there's been multiple reports that after this first attack, the Ukrainians were pushed back basically to their original starting lines. So the attack, in effect, was a failure. And for me, the figure that stands out, well, the figures that stand out in this report, if we are to believe what the Russians say, is that 16 tanks were destroyed. The Russians usually talk about armoured vehicles, and they don't distinguish tanks from armoured vehicles, but on this occasion they do. And they talk about 16 tanks and 300 Ukrainian servicemen. Now, 300 out of a force of 3,000 is a 10% loss rate. So if we judge this from what the Russians are saying, Ukrainian losses have been extremely heavy. And 16 tanks seems to me off the scale. It would represent a significant chunk of Ukraine's tank force concentrated in this area. So, can we believe these claims? Well, Ukraine has offered no alternative narrative for these events. We are entirely tied to reports that the Russians have been giving us. And when I say the Russians, I don't just mean the Russian Ministry of Defense, I mean all sorts of people, Telegram channels, bloggers, war reporters, journalists from the Russian side who have been giving us considerable detail about the course of the fighting. In some respects, perhaps the most helpful person, again, at least for me, has been Zaporozhzhie, the person who writes under the pen name Colonel Kassad. And so far as I have been able to see, he endorses the Russian Defense Ministry's account of what happened yesterday. Now, can I just say also that I have consistently found that alongside Slavyangrad, Zaporozhzhie is one of the most reliable sources of what is going on the battlefronts in Ukraine. So all that suggests that Ukraine yesterday in Zaporozhzhie region suffered a significant defeat. Now, there have been more attacks since then, and Vladimir Rogov said that after this attack, which I've just discussed here, Ukraine launched a further attack. He said it was a more complicated and multi-dimensional attack than the one that was launched yesterday. And again, we're getting scattered reports which tell us where this attack was launched from, and it appears to have been launched from the area close to Vuhledar. And it seems that the Ukrainians successfully feinted. They gave the impression that they were going to attack the Russians in one direction, but in fact they did advance in a different direction, and according to some reports they captured a small village. Anyway, this village was fought over during the night. These are all attacks that happened over the course of last night and early this morning, and which, by the way, to some extent are still ongoing. But what appears to have happened is that, again, this is all taking it from Russian sources, that the Russians stood their ground, that they did lose that village. There was enough sufficient time, the Russian forces there stood their ground long enough to enable reserves to be committed to the area by the Russians. And as of the time of my making this video, there are reports that the village has been recaptured by the Russians and that the Russians are in the process of undertaking a counterattack, essentially again pushing the Ukrainians back to their start lines. Now, I am getting absolutely astonishing reports about the total level of Ukrainian casualties over the course of the last 2 days. If, again, and I can't emphasize this too strongly, you believe the Russian sources, which are, however, as I said before, coming from multiple places, though one must always allow for the possibility that people are echoing each other, that they're echoing what others have said. Anyways, apparently there have been more losses of tanks. I believe that the total now of tanks that the Russians claim the Ukrainians have lost over the course of the last 24 hours now numbers somewhere between 25 and 30. And of course there's been more vehicles destroyed, including armoured vehicles, Ukrainian armoured vehicles, and artillery pieces also destroyed, and that the reports also suggest that Ukrainian losses again are very high, and over the course of the entire fighting of the last 24 hours, the Russians say that up to 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or in some way put out of action. Presumably, they were severely wounded or, in some cases, taken prisoner. I am not able, obviously, to confirm or corroborate these figures, but there is photographic evidence now starting to pour in from the battlefield, which does show several, in fact, a significant number of armoured vehicles and trucks, which clearly belong to the Ukrainian military and which appear to have been destroyed in the fighting. I have to say that I personally have not seen a photograph or a picture that shows something I can securely identify as a tank which has been destroyed. But of course, as I've said many times, I don't see very well, at least I don't see photographs and film very well, and I'm not the best person to analyse photographs and films of this nature, and perhaps I'm wrong, and besides, it is an absolute certainty that I have not seen all of the photographs and pictures which have appeared. I'm sure that there are many more that have passed me by. Can I say also that tanks are large vehicles, obviously. They're highly visible from a distance, and it should be easy for Russian drones and surveillance instruments to be able to keep track of them. And if tanks have indeed been destroyed, several apparently, at least 7 apparently, through striking mines, if tanks have been destroyed or damaged and rendered inoperable, at least in this offensive, then the Russians are very likely to have kept an accurate tally of the score. So either the Russians are lying, or they have indeed destroyed all of the tanks that they say they have. I don't see why the Russians would lie about this, to be honest. Who would they be deceiving? Themselves? Not the Ukrainians, not presumably the Western powers. So I'm going to go with these Russian claims. They have tended to be reliable in the past, at least when they come from the Russian Defense Ministry. Though I want to stress again, I am not saying that the Russian Defense Ministry always tells the truth. I have known at least 2 occasions, which I've discussed before in earlier videos, when they have not done so. But on this occasion, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to assume that they are indeed telling the truth. I'm not going to discuss the fighting further at the moment, save to say that it appears to be ongoing, though, as I said, the reports that I'm seeing at the moment suggest that it is the Russians that are on the attack in this area, rather than the Ukrainians, that they're counterattacking to push the Ukrainians back to their start lines, and, as I said, that they've recaptured this particular village. Now, a number of things to say. Firstly, if these losses that the Russians are claiming to have inflicted on the Ukrainians are correct, then this offensive is unsustainable. Losses at this level cannot be sustained for more than, well, probably a couple of weeks at most. And when I say a couple of weeks, perhaps 2 weeks would be generous. 2,000 men killed and wounded and taken out of action is about a brigade's worth of troops. Perhaps a little less, but anyway, roughly that. And this offensive appears to have been, these attacks appear to have involved at least some of the troops from these 12 brigades that Ukraine has prepared for this offensive, though it is important to stress that for the moment, though it's clear that Western armoured vehicles have been used to some extent the tanks at least were not apparent. The tanks that have been destroyed and which the Ukrainians were using in this attack apparently were not Western tanks. They were not Leopard 2s or Challenger 2s. They were T-72s, presumably the tanks provided to Ukraine by Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and those other countries. So, that's the first thing to say. An offensive that is experiencing losses on this scale is already an unsustainable offensive. It can't be kept up for very long. The second thing I'm going to say is that this attack, one of the reasons it probably failed and failed so quickly is because the Russian Ministry of Defense has informed us that no less a person than General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff and overall commander of Russian forces involved in the special military operation, is actually located, has actually been located in one of the regional headquarters and is presumably there and is able to make immediate, instant decisions as the news pours in to order troops, Russian troops, to defend in particular places and to attack in others. And again, speaking as somebody who's had a management role in the past, I can say that in any complex situation, having the person who is in overall charge, assuming they have the necessary abilities, present on the spot and able to make the decisions quickly, is something that is extremely useful at a moment of crisis like the one we're seeing at the moment. Anyway, the third thing I'm going to say, next, a few other things I'm going to say about this offensive is, of course, that not only has it failed, but at least this attack appears to have failed, or these series of attacks appear to have failed, at least for the moment. But Ukraine has remained completely silent about them. Presumably, if Ukraine was making some gains, they would have advanced it, they would have announced it. But of course, the pattern of Ukraine remaining silent when its forces first go on the attack is very similar to what we have seen in the past. It was the practice Ukraine followed at the time of its Kharkiv offensive, and it is also the pattern it followed at the start of the Kherson offensive. A Ukrainian official, I think it was Podolyak, actually said that there would be no prior announcement by Ukraine that the offensive was underway. That's not what they would do. It would gradually evolve over time. Now, there's a number of further things to say about that, but one effect of this is that obviously the Ukrainians are not contradicting the Russian narrative at any point. They're not commenting about it, they're not discussing it. But secondly, we can see again the effectiveness of this Ukrainian practice that I discussed in my previous video, of going on the attack and not announcing that you were engaged in an actual offensive. That means that if your attack is repulsed, even if you've suffered heavy losses, you can say, well, it was only a reconnaissance in force, it was only a shaping action, shaping the battlefield in some way. So that enables you to avoid the embarrassment of talking about the failure of the first attack that you have launched over the course of this offensive. Alternatively, if the attack breaks through, if it achieves real gains, well, you can then come forward and say that the offensive has indeed been launched and is succeeding. So Ukraine has it both ways. I think, as I said, this is, in some respects, a clever strategy, a clever media strategy. But it does mean that Ukraine is allowing, for the moment, the Russians to provide us all the details about what is going on. And I have to repeat again, this information comes from a diversity of different Russian sources. Third thing I'm going to say is perhaps the most intriguing thing of all, and I want to return to the topic of General Gerasimov. Now, the fact that he is there on the spot, as I said, confers upon the Russians an advantage. Now, it could be that he was there by chance. He might have been undertaking an inspection, and the attack happened exactly at the time when he was conducting this inspection, so he was there on the scene by chance, or as the Russians would say, through good fortune, and that's why he was able to take immediate charge of what was going on. But I have to say there is another alternative explanation, and it is a more plausible one. Now, let's go back to certain things that we've learnt over the recent weeks. One from the Royal United Services Institute in Britain. They're saying that the Russians have successfully decrypted some of Ukraine's communications traffic, so that they're able to listen in to Ukrainian communications. And that long article, War on the Rocks, about the state of the Ukrainian forces, which I discussed yesterday, squirreled in an admission that Ukrainian officers are worried that some of the soldiers that they command, that their sympathies are with the Russians rather than with Ukraine, and might be passing on information to the Russians. In other words, that the Ukrainian military suffers from a problem of spies, Russian spies. One way or the other, it does seem to me that the most plausible explanation for General Gerasimov's presence is that the Russians knew that this attack was coming when they knew the location where it was going to come, and they were aware of the basic timing of this attack. Now, as I said, that seems to me the most plausible explanation of why General Gerasimov is there on the scene. And that must have some implications for the Ukrainian attack overall, the consequences of the Ukrainian attack overall, because it means that the Russians clearly are able to second guess what Ukraine's moves are going to be. They might not be able to anticipate every single move that Ukraine makes. I said that in the attack early this morning, Ukraine apparently led the Russians to think it was going to attack in one direction, when in fact it attacked from another. But overall, the Russians do seem to have a very clear picture, not just of where the Ukrainian forces are, but of what they're going to do and when. And that has serious consequences, because it means that when Ukraine launches these offensives, whatever remaining element of surprise might previously have existed has essentially gone. Now, I talked about the Russians overhearing Ukrainian communications and having broken the encryption that would have protected those communications. This is from, as I said, the Royal United Services Institute. And I spoke about Ukrainian officers apparently fearing collaborators with the Russians in their own ranks, and that was from that article in War on the Rocks. But there's been a really very interesting series of emails to me, especially from two people to whom I must express my thanks, because yesterday I discussed this new satellite that the Russians are placing in orbit with what appears to be synthetic aperture radars, and I said that I wasn't sure exactly what this could do. Well, I've had extensive explanation from, as I say, two people as to how synthetic aperture radars work, and I'm still digesting all this information, by the way, though both accounts have been, I should stress, extremely clear. And as I said, I want to express, first of all, my very grateful thanks to both of these people, one of whom has had direct experience handling this kind of operating, this kind of technology. And a couple of things to say. It seems that these radars are really very useful in some respects. They're not an all-seeing eye. They provide images of, they can reconstruct pictures of objects on the ground, but the pictures need a considerable amount of analysis to make clear. You can't just take them in their raw state. You need to work on them, and that does require a lot of skill, and I suspect computer power. The second thing is that though these radars can work through clouds, they are apparently slightly affected by damp conditions, by rain, and this morning there has been rain in this area. But anyway, they can identify solid objects of a certain size and track them and map them accurately, provided these objects are not mobile. They're not really suitable for capturing moving troops that are moving, and obviously that's not what they are for. But going back to the 16 tanks which the Russians were claiming that they knocked out last night, in the early part of last night, well, certainly they can, with certain limits, track tanks. If a tank is solitary, it's been knocked out, it's sitting on the battlefield, then all things being equal, this radar does enable the Russians, even through cloud cover, even in dark conditions, to track and identify this particular tank, these tanks which have been knocked out. But as I said, they're not. So that these radars, these satellites, will therefore have given the Russians considerable insight into the location of Ukrainian forces and how they're deployed and such things. And they will enable the Russians also to keep track, if that's what they choose to do with these satellites, on damaged vehicles on the battlefronts. But they're not, in and of themselves, enough by themselves to provide the Russians with a comprehensive picture of what is going on. For that, other intelligence information, perhaps optical satellites that can have cameras and can take pictures or video or film of what's going on, and drones, all of those sort of things have to be deployed, and they have to be operating over the battlefront, and they have to work together, and the Russians have to assimilate this information. But one way or the other, with all of these other techniques, with perhaps the signals, the Ukrainian signals being intercepted and deciphered, with information from human sources, one way or the other, the Russians do seem to have a good overall idea of what is actually happening in southern Donbass and in Zaporozhzhie region, the area where this fighting is currently going on. So that's, I think, all we can say at the moment. There is more fighting in progress. It's quite likely that Ukraine is going to launch a further attack before long. It would be a mistake, I think, to assume that 12 brigades are the totality of the force that Ukraine is going to commit to this particular attack in Zaporozhzhie and southern Donbass. But in any event, as I said, if the losses are anything like the scale that the Russians are saying, and if this level of losses were maintained every day, then the Ukrainians would burn out of men and machines to conduct their offensive within a few weeks. So let's see what happens. Let's see what more information there is. Now, there have been other Ukrainian attacks in multiple other locations. They seem to have, according to Russian sources again, Ukraine launched counterattacks in the Marinka area, notwithstanding that within Marinka itself, the Russians are continuing their advance. I discussed this yesterday. There's been an order apparently given that Marinka must now be cleared, and the reports suggest that it is being cleared, but the Ukrainians did launch some kind of attack in the area close to Marinka. And the Ukraine also launched attacks in the Avdiivka area and a very significant attack in the Liman area on the northern front also, perhaps trying to push towards Svatovo, Kremenaya, trying to open that front again. All Russian reports are unanimous in saying that all of these attacks were unsuccessful. The most ambitious of these attacks seems to have been in the Bakhmut-Artyomovsk area, with another Ukrainian attack towards Soledar from the north. And again, the Russians say that this attack was repulsed and the Ukrainians were driven back with heavy losses to their start lines. So what the scale of those losses that Ukraine has suffered in all of these attacks is, I'm not sure. But again, these look to me like some kind of an attempt at a pinning operation, trying to force the Russians to commit troops to various parts of the battlefield, even as the main attack happens in the south, in southern Donbass and Zaporozhzhie region. Now, as I've discussed before, pinning attacks are all very well, especially if you have the numerical advantage. But it seems to me that they work a lot less well if the numerical advantage is with the other side, with the Russians in this case, as I suspect it now is. What you are doing if you attack in multiple directions is you are not pinning the other side's forces down. Instead, you are dispersing your own. And that might make you weaker in the one place where you may be launching a particular attack, which is, as I said, in this area of Zaporozhye and Donbass. Now, alongside all of this, Ukraine continues to send men and vehicles across the Russian border into Belgorod region, again pretending that these attacks are the work of anti-Putin Russian partisans. No one, I suspect, outside the British media seriously believes that. Some parts of the British media assume it to be true. But anyway, there's been an awful lot of that going on, and yesterday was a very confusing and rather wild day on the Belgorod border, one very fraught for the people who were living there, who live there. And the Russian Defense Ministry says that two diversionary reconnaissance groups, as they call them, from Ukraine were involved in these attacks at different hours of the day. Neither, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, captured any ground or was able to hold any ground. But combined with these incursions, these cross-border incursions, and heavy shelling of the border towns and villages of Belgorod region, this is putting a certain amount of political pressure on the Russian government. And it was compounded yesterday by claims from Ukraine. I say Ukraine, though, as I said, supposedly these claims are made by these supposed anti-Putin Russian partisans. Anyway, these people claimed and produced, I think it was 10 Russian soldiers who they said they had taken captive, and they provided photographs of them, and they made all kinds of rather aggressive comments. They published all kinds of aggressive comments and statements about these soldiers. They demanded to meet the governor of Belgorod region, a man called Gladkov, which he agreed to do, by the way, at a checkpoint on the border in Shebekino, except that the Ukrainians failed to show up. The purpose was that they wanted to meet him for an hour, presumably to try to persuade him to switch sides. This is all part of the fiction that these are Russian partisans and all that. And they said that in return they would hand these prisoners over to him. Well, Gladkov called the bluff. He said that he was prepared to meet these people if they were indeed prepared to hand the prisoners over. But of course they didn't do that, because I suspect these soldiers are pretty much all of them, except perhaps for the odd one, Ukrainians, or, if you believe Russian reports, Ukrainians padded out with volunteers from Poland, from the West, and from such other places. Well, obviously, as I said, they wouldn't have wanted to meet Gladkov and have their real identities exposed, so they didn't do so. But they gave the game away, as far as I'm concerned, by handing over their prisoners to the Ukrainian authorities instead of surrendering them to Gladkov, which, to my mind, all but confirms that they are indeed part of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, these attacks on Belgorod do not have any military significance, and I think that's a point that ought to be made right away. There is no evidence that Ukraine is intending a serious offensive in this direction. There are Ukrainian troops in the area, but there's certain to be Russian troops as well. And though there's a report today in the Washington Post about how President Biden is showing an increasing willingness to cross red lines, something which some people see as a sign of growing confidence by the United States that they can pull whatever Russian bluff whatever Russian red lines are, they can call Russian bluffs over these red lines, but which I actually see as a sign of growing desperation. Anyway, a willingness to take ever greater risks, in other words, because things are not working out as expected. But anyway, one way or the other, it does seem as if this particular operation, this action, certainly does have the support of the United States, but it is not of any particular military importance or significance. It's not going to change the direction of the war. But as I said, it does cause the Russian authorities considerable embarrassment. And you can already see certain actors are maneuvering to offer a role. So Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the president of Chechnya, a constituent republic of the Russian Federation, a loyal supporter of President Putin, and a commander, ultimate commander of a very significant force made up of 3 regiments, the Akhmat Special Forces Brigade, commanded by his very able deputy, Abdi Alaudinov. Anyway, Kadyrov has offered to send more Chechen volunteers to guard the Russian border. And another person has also made similar offers, though he's done so, to all appearances, in response to questions that have been put to him, though I would not personally be surprised if some of these questions, well, let's say that he might have known about them in advance. Anyway, he's offered to deploy Wagner forces to protect Russian citizens in Belgorod if the Russian army can't protect these citizens in Belgorod. Now, I think that the Russian authorities will feel uneasy about both of these offers. The one from the Chechens, I think the Russians will want to refuse for 2 reasons. Firstly, it might not be the best look if Russian borders are defended by Chechen fighters. Though having said that, I don't think that is a serious issue. But much more important and far more serious from a Russian point of view is the fact that all 3 regiments of Commander Alaudinov's force are committed and act as the spearhead in important areas of the front line, in Avdiivka, in Marinka, and before very long in Bakhmut, Artyomovsk as well. And they are fulfilling an important role there. Now, Kadyrov says that he has thousands, tens of thousands of men in reserve that he could send to the border, and perhaps he does. But I think that the Russian Ministry of Defense might be, shall we say, a little skeptical of that claim, and might be more anxious to make sure that the Chechen troops remain where they are and complete the already very important tasks that have been allocated, assigned to them. In the case of Prigozhin, it's actually even more simple. Firstly, the Wagner organization, after its strenuous activities in Bakhmut, in the Battle of Bakhmut, has withdrawn to the rear, where it is resting and being re-equipped. And it's perhaps not the ideal moment to send troops who are resting after a long battle back into combat in this way, though it's the sort of thing, I suppose, which in a crisis is done and can be done successfully. But more importantly, Prigozhin is continuing to conduct his campaign against the Russian Ministry of Defense. Yesterday, he was claiming that as Wagner troops withdrew from Artyomovsk, they were subjected to attacks by elements of the regular Russian military. And obviously there were the denials, except that a short time later, Prigozhin produced a senior officer of what he said was the 72nd Brigade, which he, and this officer made televised comments in which he appeared to confirm Prigozhin's allegations. Now, I'm going to just respond to this briefly. Firstly, the 72nd Brigade is this mysterious brigade, which Prigozhin, during the Battle of Bakhmut, the later stages of the Battle of Bakhmut, claimed had turned and fled in the face of the advance of the Azov fighters on the southern flank near Ivanivska. And there's been lots of problems identifying this brigade. There's been suggestions that it's actually a brigade of the 3rd Corps of the Donetsk People's Republic. That's been one claim. Others have said that this is a completely different force made up of Russian reservists and whatever. But anyway, the fact is that there's been some claims made by Prigozhin about this brigade, and he's now produced one of its senior officers who appears to corroborate Prigozhin's claims about troops, presumably from the 72nd Brigade, trying to take violent steps against the Wagner forces as they withdrew from Bakhmut. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I am at a complete loss to know what to make of this story, and if the officers of troops of a Russian regular forces brigade, or indeed any part of the Russian forces, really did participate in this kind of attack on the rotating Wagner forces withdrawing from Bakhmut, that was completely wrong, and the people who were concerned should be disciplined and punished. However, it is possible that this running stream of abuse from Prigozhin of regular army Russian units, and this feud that he's conducting with the Defense Ministry, which, as I said, began to expand and took in eventually the Chechens as well, as I discussed yesterday, it's perhaps unsurprising if this might have escalated to the point where soldiers from the Russian regular army and Wagner fighters came to blows. There must be increasing anger, as I've said already, not just on the part of the senior command of the Russian military, but on many of the soldiers who've actually fought in the fighting, at the way in which Wagner has taken all the attention and appears through Prigozhin to be denigrating the work of the regular Russian military. And it's not surprising if fighting men are angry about this, and some of their officers are angry about this, and this has escalated out of control. To my mind, what this episode shows is probably the extent, assuming that Prigozhin's accounts are true and that this officer is who he says he is, which I'm inclined to think he must be. Well, what it shows to my mind is that within the Russian army, Prigozhin's conduct has perhaps made Wagner rather unpopular with other Russian forces, and that may be a problem if you want to redeploy it in haste to protect Belgorod. It could be seen as unacceptable by the Russian forces that are already defending Belgorod, and it might invite more trouble, though I suppose ultimately, as I said, if the Wagner forces are redeployed to Belgorod, they would be able, with all of that, to do their job. However, much more important than this is that I can't imagine that the Russian authorities would welcome a situation where, even as he's conducting this angry feud with the Russian Defense Ministry and with much of the political leadership in Moscow, Prigozhin is able to present himself as the person who came to the rescue of Russians who are being attacked by Ukraine, and say that he is doing that which the regular Russian military seems incapable of doing, which would be what would follow if his unit, if the Wagner unit were indeed redeployed to Belgorod in a hurry. And I think that that would probably give more traction to Prigozhin's campaign against the Russian military. And I think the Russian military would not want to do that. I think that the Russian military and the Russian political leadership would probably take the view that this is not something that they want to see. They don't want to see an even bolder, more outspoken Prigozhin using purported failures by the Russian Defense Ministry in Belgorod to his advantage in this feud that he's running with the Russian Ministry of Defense and with the political leadership. So for that reason, I think that the Russians will not want to accept Prigozhin's rather roundabout invitation of redeploying his troops to Belgorod to stabilize the situation there. And I think that for the moment, they probably feel that difficult though the situation in Belgorod is, they can afford to not ignore it, obviously, but to give it less priority as they deal with the major offensive that Ukraine is conducting in the south. And here we can see again the benefits that Ukraine is deriving from launching these attacks across the border, because the Russian government has to spend time and energy not just dealing with the problem in hand by deploying troops to try to protect the border in the way that they're doing, but also to deal with the Prigozhin problem, to deal with the separate and far less serious problem that these proposals from the Chechens might cause, to deal with all of these issues and problems that this raises. And of course, from a Ukrainian point of view, Belgorod also serves a further purpose. If the fighting in Zaporozhzhie goes badly for Ukraine, which for the moment it appears to be doing, then Ukraine is able to say, well, this isn't the real place, where things are really happening. They're happening in Belgorod. And of course, it is in fact the events in Belgorod, which if you read the Russian media today, are attracting by far the most attention. Anyway, that seems to me to be the situation on the battlefronts. I suspect, to repeat again, that I think the Russians feel that from a military point of view, they have the situation in Belgorod under control. The priority is to stop this offensive that Ukraine is launching in Zaporozhye. The first 24 hours seems to have gone well for the Russians and badly for Ukraine, but that is only the first 24 hours, and we're probably going to have a very tough summer being fought out in Ukraine as Ukraine continues to try to hammer away on the Russian defense lines in Zaporozhye, looking for some place to break through. Now, a number of quick further and additional points. I said that as far as I'm concerned that this is the Ukrainian offensive. Of course, yesterday I discussed an interview that a Ukrainian official, an advisor of President Zelensky, gave, in which he said that the offensive has had to be postponed again because of inadequate weapons, that there's insufficiencies of weapons. And I said that the United States and Britain, by contrast, have continuously reiterated that Ukraine has been supplied all the weapons it needs to conduct this offensive, and that this should be seen as an order from the West and from the British and the Americans to Ukraine to conduct this offensive. And yesterday, even as Ukraine was gearing up to these attacks in Zaporozhzhie and southern Donbass, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, gave an interview to CNN in which he talked about the Ukrainian offensive coming and about the fact that he expected, that he hoped or believed that it would succeed. And again, I have to say that I think this interview was timed to coincide with the Ukrainian offensive. For all I know, it was perhaps assumed or hoped that Ukraine would have achieved some kind of breakthrough, some sort of significant success by the time the interview happened, though as it turns out that was not the case. But anyway, for me that is further confirmation that the purpose of the interview, that the offensive that we're seeing is the real offensive. The purpose of the interview was, if you like, to introduce it, to tell the American people that it is happening. And the second thing I'm going to refer to again is those reports that we were getting a couple of weeks ago in the American media about how the first 24 hours were going to be the key ones, and that the only way in which Ukraine could succeed in this offensive is if the Russian leadership was panicked and paralyzed, and if Ukraine as a result was able to achieve a rapid breakthrough. Now, perhaps events will show that things are otherwise, but assuming that this is the offensive, then you can see how these Ukrainian attacks in multiple directions, in Avdiivka and Marinka, in Liman, and these cross-border raids into Belgorod might all play into that they might all be attempts to panic the Russians, even as Ukraine goes on the attack. Except that there is no sign that the Russians have panicked. Gerasimov, as I said, is there, just behind the front lines, taking charge, apparently directing the forces, telling them how to respond, and dealing with this attack as it happened. So there's no sign of the Russians being panicked at any place. And of course, we're now past those 24 hours. Now, article, I think it was Foreign Policy, said that the breakthrough had to happen in 24 hours, otherwise the offensive would fail. If that's correct, then the offensive has failed. I will not make that assumption. I think this is perhaps putting it too strongly. I think, as I said, that more attacks are certain to come, probably on an intensifying and ever-increasing scale. And I don't think we can say that the offensive has failed, because it, so far at least, has failed to achieve a breakthrough, and has not achieved a breakthrough in the first 24 hours of the attack. What we have seen are Ukraine, as I said, according to the Russians, and there's nothing, no one is contradicting them, what we have seen is the Ukrainians suffering very heavy losses in men and machines. And so far, at least up to the point when this video is made, failing to break through. Now, there has been some more news which is relevant to the war. The Economist has been looking at the situation again of the Russian economy, asking itself whether it is indeed the case that Russia is going to run out of funds to prosecute the war. And it has found that actually the war isn't costing Russia very much. It puts the total cost of the war around 3% of Russian GDP. And I suspect that that already includes the pre-existing military budget, which has probably increased somewhat, which has definitely increased somewhat. But if The Economist is right, then to be absolutely clear, the Russians can sustain a war at this level pretty much indefinitely. Now, as several people have pointed out, if Russia committed more of its resources to prosecuting the war faster, then of course it might achieve victory more quickly. But that brings us back to the many reasons why the Russians might not be willing to do that. And one of them is the Putin government's concern to maintain domestic economic and political stability for the Russian leadership. That is the overriding priority. They are haunted, by the way, in which the Soviet Union collapsed because the economic situation within the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s had become increasingly unstable. And of course, they all know from their history books that it was domestic economic strains that also led to the protests which brought down the Tsar's government in 1917. So for all of these reasons, the Russian authorities, even if it means going more slowly than they perhaps would ideally like to do in terms of the war, are prepared to, have chosen to prosecute it at its present tempo so as not to put an excessive strain on the domestic economy. Now, can I say that is not the only reason that the Russians have conducted the war in this way? I've discussed the various other reasons, diplomatic, political, military, in other programs, but I certainly think it is one of them. The second important thing is that the Russians have apparently joined with the Saudis in agreeing to another big oil production cut of 1 million barrels a day in order to support oil prices, which despite an earlier announced cut in oil prices a few weeks ago, have nonetheless been sagging. Now, the reason why the oil price has been sagging is two reasons, despite that earlier cut, is two reasons. Firstly, the oil production cut, has to some extent been undermined by buoyant demand for Russian oil. China and India are buying as much Russian oil as they can, and the Indians in particular have been re-exporting it to Europe. And that means that there's a large amount of oil, more than perhaps had been anticipated, as the Russians have basically disregarded their earlier commitments to cut production, to fulfill all these demands from their customers. And that's had an effect on the oil price. It's not fallen, or it's not risen, as the Saudis would have wanted. It has fallen instead. The other reason, I think, why the oil price has been falling is because, again, we are looking at gathering economic news, especially in Europe, where Germany is already in recession and Britain perhaps soon will be, gathering economic news that Europe will soon be in recession, and perhaps after a lag of a few months, the United States will be in a recession also. And in this extremely sophisticated market, which is the oil market, I suspect that oil traders have come to the decision that with recession on the horizon, demand for oil in the West is going to fall, and that is putting a downward pressure on prices. Well, we will see whether this production cut the Saudis have announced succeeds, but in the meantime, it shows us that despite occasional tensions, the Saudis and the Russians are again, once more, working successfully with each other. And President Zelensky's pleas to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to change course, made at the Arab League summit a few weeks ago, have fallen on deaf ears. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. No doubt more from me soon. We will see what is happening with these renewed Ukrainian attacks, whether this Russian counterattack is going to be maintained, whether in fact Ukraine is going to go on the attack again, and how this offensive, now that it's underway, evolves. Thank you for joining me. More from me soon, and have a very good day.